In the autumn of 1984, in a peaceful suburb in Pennsylvania, a young girl suddenly vanished, and police found no evidence and the case quickly went cold. But 27 years later, a single discovery changed everything. What they found shocked everyone, and it uncovered a truth no one was prepared for. Oak Ridge was the kind of town where nothing bad ever happened. It was a place defined by its predictability. The houses all looked somewhat similar, painted in soft pastel colors with neatly trimmed front lawns and large oak trees that lined the sidewalks. People knew their neighbors by their first names. They knew whose dog was barking down the street, and they knew which kids belonged to which house. In 1984, doors were routinely left unlocked. Children rode their bicycles freely until the streetlights flickered on, signaling that it was time to come in for dinner. It was a safe, quiet, and deeply trusting community. In the middle of this quiet neighborhood lived the Miller family. Thomas Miller managed the local hardware store in the center of town. He was a hardworking, quiet man with a gentle smile and a steady presence. His wife, Martha, worked as a teller at the community bank. She was organized, warm, and deeply devoted to her two daughters. The older daughter, Sarah, was 12 years old. She was responsible, serious for her age, and fiercely protective of her younger sister. And then there was Lily. Lily was 7 years old, a burst of endless energy and sunshine. She had a gap-toothed smile, a head full of messy brown curls, and a laugh that could fill an entire room. She was the kind of child who noticed everything. She would stop to look at a strange bug on the sidewalk, or collect colorful autumn leaves to press into her notebooks. She was trusting, imaginative, and deeply loved by everyone who knew her. Lily had a small, unique birthmark just below her left collarbone, shaped almost perfectly like a tiny crescent moon. It was a detail her mother always pointed out, calling it her little star mark. Sarah and Lily were incredibly close. Despite the 5-year age gap, they spent most of their time together. Because both of their parents worked until 5 o'clock in the evening, Sarah was given the responsibility of watching out for Lily after school. It was a routine they had practiced perfectly since Lily started first grade. Sarah's middle school let out at 2:45, giving her just enough time to walk to the elementary school bus stop at the corner of Elm Street and Maple Drive. She would wait there for 10 minutes, sitting on a low stone wall, until Lily's big yellow school bus pulled up with a squeak of its heavy brakes. Then, the two sisters would walk the remaining 3 blocks home together. Those 3 blocks were incredibly safe. The route took them past the Henderson house, where old Mr. Henderson spent his afternoons tending to his rose bushes. It took them past the neighborhood park, a small patch of green grass with a single wooden swing set. And finally, it took them down their own street, a quiet cul-de-sac where the only traffic was the occasional neighbor returning from work. It was a walk that took less than 10 minutes. It was a walk they had done hundreds of times without a single issue. But Tuesday, October 14, 1984, was not a normal day. It started like any other crisp autumn morning. The air was cold and the ground was covered in a thick blanket of orange and yellow leaves. The sky was a heavy, overcast gray, threatening rain but never quite delivering it. At breakfast, the house was filled with the usual morning chaos. Thomas was drinking his coffee and reading the local newspaper. Martha was packing lunches at the kitchen counter. Sarah was rushing to finish a math worksheet she had forgotten about the night before. Lily was sitting at the table, humming a song she had learned in music class, completely unbothered by the rush around her. She was wearing her favorite bright yellow raincoat, even though it wasn't raining yet. She insisted on wearing it because she liked the way the bright color looked against the dull autumn sky. Martha packed a sandwich, an apple, and a small chocolate chip cookie into Lily's red plastic lunchbox. She handed it to her youngest daughter with a kiss on the forehead. "Have a good day, sweetie," Martha said, smoothing down Lily's messy curls. "I will, Mommy," Lily replied, grabbing her lunchbox and swinging it back and forth. Thomas kissed both his daughters goodbye and headed out to his truck. Martha gathered her purse and car keys. Before they left the house, Sarah pulled her jacket on and looked at her mother. "Mom, I have a science project meeting after school today," Sarah said. "It's going to take about an hour. I won't be able to meet Lily at the bus stop at 3:15. Martha paused, looking at her watch. She frowned slightly, thinking over the logistics. The school bus couldn't be changed. Neither Thomas nor Martha could leave work early that day. It was the middle of the week and the bank was incredibly busy. "Are you sure you have to stay?" Martha asked. "I have to, Mom. It's for a major grade and my partner can only meet today in the library," Sarah explained. Martha sighed softly, looking down at Lily, who was busy trying to tie her shoelaces. It was only 3 blocks. It was the same neighborhood they had lived in for 10 years. Every neighbor on that route knew Lily. Mr. Henderson was always out in his garden. Mrs. Gable was usually sitting on her porch. It was broad daylight. Nothing bad ever happened in Oak Ridge. "All right," Martha finally said, turning to her youngest daughter. "Lily, listen to me carefully. Sarah has to stay late at school today. When the bus drops you off at the corner, you are going to walk straight home by yourself. Do you understand?" Lily looked up, her bright eyes wide, and nodded confidently. "I know the way, Mommy. It's just past the swing set." "Exactly," Martha said, smiling gently. "You walk straight home. You don't stop to talk to anyone. You don't go to the park. You go straight to our front door, you use your key to unlock it, and you lock it right behind you. Then you wait for Sarah to get home. She will be there by 4 o'clock. "Okay," Lily promised. She seemed almost excited by the prospect of doing it all on her own. It made her feel grown up. Sarah looked at her little sister, feeling a brief, fleeting pang of guilt. "I'll be home as fast as I can, Lily. Just go straight inside and watch cartoons until I get there." That was the plan. It was a simple, logical plan. A plan made by a trusting family in a trusting town. No one could have possibly known that those 3 short blocks would soon become the center of a nightmare. No one could have known that the bright yellow raincoat would be the last thing they ever saw her wear. The day progressed normally. The school bells rang. The classes ended. At 3 o'clock, the elementary school released its students. The loud, chaotic energy of hundreds of children filled the hallways as they rushed toward the waiting fleet of yellow buses. According to the bus driver, a kind, older woman named Mrs. Higgins, Lily boarded the bus exactly as she always did. She sat in the 3rd row on the right side. She was quiet, looking out the window at the passing trees. At exactly 3:15 in the afternoon, the bus pulled up to the corner of Elm Street and Maple Drive. The heavy doors swung open with a loud mechanical hiss. 3 children got off the bus at that stop. 2 brothers who lived directly on the corner immediately ran up their own driveway and went inside their house. The 3rd child was Lily. Mrs. Higgins later told the police that she watched Lily step down onto the sidewalk. She saw the bright yellow raincoat. She watched as Lily turned toward the direction of her house, gripping her red plastic lunchbox in her right hand. The doors of the bus closed, and Mrs. Higgins drove away, continuing her route. That was the last confirmed sighting of 7-year-old Lily Miller. At 3:45, Sarah finished her science project meeting at the middle school library. She packed up her books quickly, eager to get home. The autumn air had grown significantly colder as the afternoon wore on. The sky was darker now, a deep, bruised gray, and the wind had picked up, sending dry leaves scraping harshly across the pavement. Sarah walked briskly, her backpack heavy on her shoulders. She wasn't overly worried. She knew Lily was a smart girl. She assumed she would walk into the house, find Lily sitting cross-legged in front of the television, watching her favorite animated shows, with cookie crumbs on her chin. Sarah reached her house at exactly 4 o'clock. The house was quiet. The front yard was empty. She walked up to the front door and reached for the handle. It was locked. Sarah paused. That wasn't entirely unusual. Her mother had told Lily to lock the door behind her. Sarah pulled her key from her backpack, slid it into the lock, and turned it. The door clicked open. She stepped inside, dropping her heavy backpack onto the floor of the entryway. The house was completely silent. The television was not on. The lights were all off, leaving the living room bathed in the dim, gloomy light of the overcast afternoon. "Lily," Sarah called out. Her voice echoed slightly in the quiet house. There was no answer. "Lily, I'm home," Sarah called again, walking into the kitchen. The kitchen was empty. The counter was exactly as they had left it that morning. She walked down the short hallway to the bedrooms. She checked her parents' room. Empty. She checked the bathroom. Empty. Finally, she opened the door to the bedroom she shared with Lily. The beds were made. Lily's toys were neatly arranged in the corner. The room was empty. A cold, uneasy feeling started to creep into Sarah's stomach. It wasn't panic yet, just a sharp prick of confusion. She walked back into the living room and looked out the front window. The street was quiet. Maybe Lily had gotten bored waiting and went out to the backyard to play. Sarah opened the back door and stepped out onto the patio. "Lily," she yelled. The wind caught her voice and carried it away. The backyard was empty. The old wooden fence stood tall and silent. Sarah went back inside and picked up the kitchen telephone. Her fingers felt a little stiff as she dialed the number for her mother's bank. She had to wait on hold for a moment before her mother's voice finally came on the line. "Bank of Oak Ridge, this is Martha," her mother answered smoothly. "Mom, it's Sarah," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Hi, honey, are you home? How did the science project go?" Martha asked, her tone light and casual. "It went fine, Mom. Is Lily with you?" There was a sudden, heavy pause on the other end of the line. The casual tone instantly vanished from Martha's voice. "What do you mean, is she with me? She's supposed to be at home, Sarah. I told her to go straight home." "She's not here, Mom," Sarah said, the uneasy feeling now growing into a heavy knot of dread. "I got home 10 minutes ago. The door was locked. She's not in the house. She's not in the backyard. I've looked everywhere." "Did you check next door? Maybe she went over to play with the neighbor's dog," Martha suggested, though her voice had tightened. "I haven't checked yet, but you told her not to stop anywhere." "I know I did," Martha said quickly. Her breath hitched slightly. "Listen to me, Sarah. Go outside. Walk back toward the bus stop. Maybe she was walking slowly and got distracted by something. I'm going to tell my manager I have to leave right now. I'm calling your father. Go look for her." The line clicked dead. Sarah hung up the phone. Her heart was starting to beat faster now. It didn't make sense. It just didn't. Lily was an obedient child. She wouldn't just wander off. Sarah grabbed her jacket, zipped it up tight against the cold wind, and ran out the front door, leaving it unlocked behind her. She started walking down the street, retracing the exact route Lily was supposed to take. The first block was entirely residential, houses with neat lawns and silent driveways. Sarah looked left and right, her eyes scanning the yards, hopping to see the bright flash of a yellow raincoat. Nothing. She walked past the neighborhood park. The single wooden swing set was empty, the chain swaying slightly in the autumn wind. The park was deserted. As she reached the beginning of the second block, she saw Mr. Henderson in his front yard. He was wearing thick gardening gloves, kneeling beside his rose bushes with a pair of pruning shears. "Mr. Henderson," Sarah called out, running toward his yard. The old man stood up slowly, pushing his glasses up his nose. "Hello, Sarah. You're in a hurry today." "Mr. Henderson, did you see my sister? Did you see Lily walk by here earlier?" Sarah asked, her breathing coming in short, anxious gasps. Mr. Henderson frowned, looking down the street. He took off his gloves slowly. "Lily, the little one? No, I haven't seen her today. I've been out here since about 3 o'clock trying to get these bushes trimmed before the frost hits. It's been awful quiet all afternoon." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. If Mr. Henderson had been in his front yard since 3 o'clock, he would have absolutely seen Lily walk past. His house was directly on the route. He had a clear view of the sidewalk. If he didn't see her, it meant she never made it this far. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, turning away before he could ask any more questions. She started running. She ran past the rest of the houses on the second block. Her lungs burned in the cold air. She was desperately searching the edges of the sidewalk, looking under parked cars, looking behind large oak trees. The wind roared loudly in her ears. She finally reached the corner of Elm Street and Maple Drive. The bus stop. The stone wall where she always waited was empty. The street was quiet. There were no children playing. There were no cars driving by. Just the rustling of dry leaves scraping across the asphalt. Sarah stood at the corner, turning in a full circle, her eyes wide with rising terror. Where could she have gone? There was nowhere to hide. There was nowhere to disappear to. It was just a straight line of houses and sidewalks. And then she saw it. About 20 feet away from the corner, resting on top of the low stone wall that bordered the Miller's property line, was a small object. It was bright red. Sarah walked toward it slowly. Her legs felt heavy, like she was walking through deep water. The closer she got, the more clearly she could see it. It was Lily's red plastic lunchbox. But it wasn't dropped on the ground. It wasn't tossed aside. It was placed perfectly upright on the flat surface of the stone wall. The handle was folded down neatly. It looked incredibly deliberate, as if Lily had gently set it down so she could use both her hands for something else, or as if someone else had taken it from her and placed it there. Sarah reached out with a trembling hand and touched the cold plastic. It was completely dry. It hadn't been there long. "Lily," Sarah screamed. It wasn't a call anymore. It was a scream of pure, desperate terror. The sound tore through the quiet neighborhood, echoing off the sides of the houses. "Lily." Silence answered her, the kind of deep, heavy silence that feels completely wrong. Within 20 minutes, the entire atmosphere of Oak Ridge shifted from a peaceful afternoon to a state of frantic emergency. Martha's car sped into the neighborhood, screeching to a halt at the corner of Elm and Maple. She burst out of the car before the engine was even fully turned off. Thomas arrived moments later in his work truck, his face pale and tight with fear. Sarah stood by the stone wall, clutching the red lunchbox to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She tried to explain everything to her parents, her voice breaking. She explained about the locked door, about the empty park, about what Mr. Henderson had said. Martha was practically hyperventilating. She grabbed Sarah by the shoulders. "You found this here, right here." "Yes," Sarah sobbed. "She set it down, Mom. It was just sitting there." Thomas didn't waste time talking. He immediately began knocking on the doors of the houses near the intersection. The two brothers who had gotten off the bus with Lily were questioned by their mother. They said they saw Lily get off the bus. They saw her start walking toward her house. Then they went inside and didn't look back. That was all they knew. By 5 o'clock, the sun had fully set beneath the thick gray clouds. The neighborhood was plunged into an eerie, cold darkness. The yellow streetlights flickered on, casting long, strange shadows across the lawns. The police had been called. Chief Miller, no relation to the family, despite the shared last name, was the first to arrive. He was a veteran officer, a man who had worked in Oak Ridge for 30 years. He had seen teenagers run away. He had seen lost dogs, but he had never seen a child simply vanish in broad daylight in the span of 10 minutes. 2 squad cars parked at the intersection, their red and blue lights spinning silently, washing the faces of the terrified parents in harsh, alternating colors. More neighbors came out of their houses. A search party formed almost organically. Men with flashlights began combing through the small patch of woods behind the subdivision. Women checked their garages and backyard sheds. The entire community was turned upside down. "We need a timeline," Chief Miller said to Thomas, standing under the glow of a streetlight. The chief had a small notepad out. "The bus driver says she dropped her off at 3:15. Sarah, you walked this route at 3:45 and you didn't see her." "No," Sarah cried softly, standing close to her mother. "I didn't see anyone, just the lunchbox." "And Mr. Henderson was outside his house from 3:00 onwards. He says she never walked past his house." The chief looked at the map of the street. That means she disappeared in the space of half a block, between this corner and the park, sometime between 3:15 and 3:45. It was an impossibly small window of time. It was an impossibly small physical area. How does a child disappear in 300 feet of open sidewalk in the middle of the afternoon? Did she have any reason to run off? The chief asked gently. Was she upset about anything, trouble at school? She's 7 years old, Martha yelled, the panic finally breaking through her polite exterior. She doesn't run away. She was wearing a bright yellow raincoat. You can see it from a mile away. Someone took her. Someone must have taken her. The reality of that statement hung heavily in the freezing autumn air. A kidnapping in Oak Ridge. It was unthinkable. But as the hours dragged on and the darkness deepened, it became the only logical conclusion. By 8 o'clock that night, the state police were involved. They brought in 2 K9 units, large tracking dogs trained to follow human scent. An officer took the red lunchbox from Sarah, handling it carefully with gloves, and presented it to the dogs. The large German shepherd sniffed the plastic intently. The handler gave a command, and the dogs immediately put their noses to the ground. The entire neighborhood watched in absolute silence as the dogs began to move. They started at the stone wall. They sniffed in a tight circle. Then they moved toward the sidewalk. Sarah held her breath. Her mother gripped her hand so tightly it hurt. If the dogs could track her, they could find her. Maybe she was just hiding. Maybe she was scared. But the dogs didn't go far. They walked exactly 4 steps away from the stone wall, out toward the very edge of the curb, right where the street met the sidewalk. And then they stopped. They sniffed the asphalt. They circled the same small spot of pavement 3 times. They whined, looking up at their handler in confusion. "What is it?" Thomas asked, stepping forward. "Did they lose the scent?" The handler looked grim. He pulled the dogs back and reset them, trying again. The dogs repeated the exact same motion. They tracked from the wall to the curb and then stopped completely. "They didn't lose the scent, Mr. Miller," the handler said quietly. "The scent ends here. It doesn't fade away, it just stops, right here on the curb." A collective chill ran through the crowd of neighbors standing nearby. "What does that mean?" Martha whispered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "It means," Chief Miller said, his voice heavy with dread, "that she didn't walk away from this spot. She was put into a vehicle." The words hit the family like a physical blow. Martha collapsed against Thomas, letting out a sharp, devastating wail that Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. A vehicle. A car had pulled up right next to her. The lunchbox had been set down, and then she was gone. "Did anyone see a car?" Chief Miller yelled out to the gathered neighbors. "Did anyone see a car driving down this street between 3:15 and 3:30? Any delivery trucks? Any strange vehicles?" People looked at each other, shaking their heads. It was the middle of the afternoon. People were at work. The street was quiet. Then a quiet voice spoke up from the back of the crowd. It was Mrs. Gable, an elderly woman who lived in the house directly across from the bus stop. She looked frail, clutching her cardigan tightly around herself in the cold wind. "I didn't think anything of it," Mrs. Gable said nervously, her voice trembling. "My eyes aren't what they used to be, but right around 3 o'clock before the bus came, I saw a car parked under the big oak tree down the street, right near the park." The police chief instantly zeroed in on her. "What kind of car, Mrs. Gable?" "A sedan," she said slowly. "It was silver or maybe a light gray. It looked clean, but the engine was running. I remember because I could see the exhaust in the cold air. It was just sitting there idling." "Did you see who was inside?" "No," Mrs. Gable shook her head. "The windows were tinted, or maybe it was just the glare from the clouds. I couldn't see the driver. It just sat there for a long time. And then when I went to the kitchen to make my tea, I heard it drive away. That must have been around 3:20. A silver sedan parked near the park, waiting, watching." Sarah felt her legs give out. She sank to her knees on the cold, hard grass. She was supposed to be there. She was supposed to walk her sister home. If she hadn't stayed for the science project, she would have been sitting on that wall. She would have held Lily's hand. She would have seen the silver car. Instead, a stranger had watched a 7-year-old girl get off a school bus completely alone. A stranger had watched her walk down the quiet, empty street. And in the span of a few silent minutes, under the gray autumn sky, they had taken her away. The police set up roadblocks. They issued statewide alerts. They searched every silver sedan in a 50-mile radius. But as the night wore on and the cold wind blew the dry leaves across the dark streets of Oak Ridge, the terrible, sickening reality began to settle in. There were no tire tracks left on the hard asphalt. There were no witnesses who saw the actual moment it happened. There was no sign of a struggle. Just a red plastic lunchbox sitting neatly on a stone wall, and a little girl who had vanished into thin air. The nightmare had officially begun. And no one, especially not 12-year-old Sarah, had any idea how incredibly long the nightmare would last, or what horrifying secret was waiting decades in the future to tear the family apart all over again. The night of October 14th stretched into a waking nightmare. As the hours crawled past midnight, the Miller house transformed from a warm, quiet family home into a chaotic, brightly lit command center. The front door stood wide open, letting the freezing autumn wind sweep through the hallway. Uniformed police officers walked heavily across the living room carpet, their boots tracking in mud and dry leaves. The dining room table, where the family had eaten dinner just 24 hours earlier, was now completely covered in large topographical maps of the surrounding county, illuminated by harsh portable work lights. Thomas and Martha sat on the living room sofa, surrounded by this frantic activity, yet entirely disconnected from it. They looked like ghosts. Martha had not stopped shaking since she arrived home. She sat with her arms wrapped tightly around her own waist, staring blankly at the front window, waiting for a yellow raincoat to magically appear in the darkness. Thomas sat beside her, his jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle jumped nervously in his cheek. He repeatedly ran his hands through his hair, answering the same questions from different officers over and over again, his voice slowly wearing down into a harsh, dry whisper. Sarah was placed in the kitchen with a female officer who offered her a glass of water that she could not bring herself to drink. Sarah felt as though she were trapped inside a glass box, watching the world fall apart around her while being unable to breathe. Every time the police radio on the kitchen counter crackled to life with a burst of static, Sarah flinched, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was waiting for the words. She was waiting for someone to say they had found her. But the radio only brought updates of empty streets and dead ends. When the sun finally began to rise on the second day, it brought no warmth and no comfort. The gray clouds from the previous afternoon had thickened, casting a dull, sickly light over the neighborhood. The official search effort expanded drastically. It was no longer just the local police and a few worried neighbors. By 8 o'clock in the morning, nearly 300 volunteers had gathered in the parking lot of the community church. The town of Oak Ridge practically shut down. The hardware store remained locked. The bank opened with half its staff. Teachers at the elementary school wept in the teachers' lounge. The volunteers were organized into grid search teams. They wore thick hunting jackets and heavy boots, carrying walking sticks to push aside the dense brush in the woods behind the subdivision. Sarah insisted on going with her father. She refused to stay in the house. She needed to be moving. She needed to fix what she felt she had broken. For 10 exhausting hours, they walked shoulder to shoulder through the damp, cold forest. They checked every hollow log. They looked down into every drainage ditch. They combed through the thick patches of blackberry brambles, completely ignoring the thorns that tore at their clothes and scratched their hands. The sound of hundreds of people shouting Lily's name echoed through the trees, a haunting, desperate chorus that slowly grew weaker as the day wore on. But they found nothing. They did not find a dropped mitten. They did not find a footprint in the mud. They did not find a torn piece of bright yellow fabric snagged on a branch. The woods were entirely empty. The realization settled over the search party like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Lily had not wandered off. She had not gotten lost playing in the trees. The terrifying theory of the silver sedan was no longer just a possibility. It was the only reality left. By the end of the first week, the local police realized they were entirely out of their depth. Chief Miller officially requested the assistance of the state police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Suddenly, the quiet streets of Oak Ridge were filled with dark, unmarked cars and men in sharp suits. The investigation shifted aggressively from a missing person search to a criminal abduction case. The FBI agents were methodical, cold, and entirely focused on the facts. Their first step was a massive undertaking, tracking down the silver sedan. In 1984, this was an incredibly difficult task. There were no computerized highway cameras, no automated license plate readers, and no digital databases that could instantly cross-reference vehicle colors with local addresses. The investigators had to rely on paper records from the Department of Motor Vehicles. They pulled the files for every registered silver or light gray sedan in a 50-mile radius. It resulted in a list of over 4,000 vehicles. Detectives began the agonizing process of knocking on doors, interviewing owners, and checking alibis for the afternoon of October 14th. They checked local mechanics and auto body shops, asking if anyone had brought in a silver car for a sudden paint job or interior cleaning. They set up a dedicated tip line, begging the public to call in with any information about a silver car seen near the elementary school or the neighborhood park. But the description provided by elderly Mrs. Gable was tragically thin. She didn't know the make of the car. She didn't know the model. She couldn't remember if it had 2 doors or 4. She hadn't seen a single letter or number on the license plate. She couldn't even say for certain if the driver was a man or a woman. The silver sedan was a ghost. It had materialized under the oak tree, swallowed a 7-year-old girl, and vanished without leaving a single trace of evidence behind. As the physical search yielded no results, the investigation turned inward, following standard, yet brutal police procedures. The detectives had to look at the people closest to the victim. They had to look at the family. It happened on the 10th day. 2 state detectives arrived at the house and asked Thomas and Martha to come down to the station for formal interviews. They were placed in separate, windowless rooms. The detectives were no longer treating them like grieving parents. They were treating them like potential suspects. They asked Thomas about his finances. They asked if the hardware store was failing. They asked if he had any gambling debts or hidden enemies who might want to hurt his family. They asked him, point blank, if he had ever lost his temper and struck Lily. Thomas sat in the hard wooden chair, his face pale with a mixture of profound exhaustion and rising anger. He provided his alibi, detailing exactly which customers he was helping at the store between 3 and 4 o'clock. His employees backed up his story perfectly, but the indignity of the questions broke something deep inside him. It shattered his fundamental trust in the people who were supposed to be finding his daughter. Martha's interview was even more devastating. The detectives pushed her on her relationship with her children. They questioned why she would let a 7-year-old walk home alone, subtly implying that her negligence was suspicious. Martha completely broke down. She sobbed so violently she could barely breathe, her tears soaking the collar of her blouse. She felt like she was being accused of the very nightmare she was living. She provided her alibi from the bank, which was ironclad, but the emotional damage was done. The parents were officially cleared of any suspicion, but the house felt even colder when they returned. The psychological toll on Sarah was arguably the worst of all. She had completely stopped going to school. She spent her days sitting on the floor of the bedroom she shared with Lily, staring at her sister's perfectly made bed. The stuffed animals sat in their usual rows, waiting for a little girl who wasn't coming back. A child psychologist working with the police came to the house to interview Sarah. The woman was gentle, speaking in a soft, soothing voice, but the questions were still a brutal reliving of the worst day of Sarah's life. The psychologist asked Sarah to walk through the morning routine again. She asked about the walk home, about finding the lunchbox, about every single detail. "It's my fault," Sarah whispered during the interview, her eyes fixed firmly on the floor. "I told her I would be there. I was supposed to be there. I traded her life for a science project." The psychologist tried to comfort her, explaining that she was only 12 years old and could not possibly have known what was going to happen. But the words meant absolutely nothing to Sarah. In her mind, the equation was simple and unforgiving. If she had skipped the meeting, she would have been at the bus stop. She would have held Lily's hand. She would have looked the driver of the silver car in the eye, and her sister would still be here. This crushing burden of guilt settled directly onto Sarah's shoulders, heavy enough to alter the entire course of her life. Weeks turned into a month. The initial frantic energy of the investigation slowly began to fade, replaced by a grim, enduring silence. The police command center was moved out of the Miller house and back to the station. The constant ringing of the telephone slowed down to a few sporadic calls a day. The thousands of missing person flyers that had been taped to every telephone pole and storefront window in Oak Ridge began to weather. The bright ink faded in the November rain. The tape peeled away, leaving the posters hanging by a single corner, flapping uselessly in the cold wind. Thanksgiving arrived, and it was a hollow, agonizing day. The extended family did not come over. Martha cooked nothing. Thomas sat in his armchair, staring at the television without turning it on. The empty chair at the dining table was a physical wound in the room, radiating a deep, silent pain that none of them knew how to talk about. The community of Oak Ridge was forever changed by the tragedy. The profound sense of safety that had defined the town was completely shattered. Parents no longer allowed their children to play in the front yards without direct supervision. The walk to the bus stop became a heavily guarded daily operation. Mothers and fathers stood on the street corners every morning and every afternoon, gripping their children's hands tightly, their eyes constantly scanning the street for unfamiliar cars. The innocence of the town had been stolen, just as swiftly as Lily had been. Throughout the winter, the police chased down dozens of false leads. These dead ends were almost more painful than the silence. In early December, a truck driver called the tip line to report that he had seen a little girl matching Lily's exact description at a roadside diner in Ohio, more than 300 miles away. The girl was wearing a yellow raincoat and seemed to be afraid of the man she was traveling with. The state police immediately contacted the local authorities in Ohio. Officers rushed to the diner, interviewed the waitstaff, and managed to track down the license plate of the vehicle the man was driving. The entire Miller family sat in their living room, not daring to breathe, waiting for the phone to ring. Martha had her coat on, fully prepared to jump into the car and drive across 3 states the second the police gave the word. 3 agonizing hours later, Chief Miller pulled into their driveway. He didn't even use the radio. He came to deliver the news in person. The police in Ohio had pulled over the vehicle. It was a grandfather traveling with his 8-year-old granddaughter. She was wearing a yellow windbreaker, and she had been crying in the diner because she had dropped her ice cream. It was a complete misunderstanding. Martha collapsed onto the front porch, her screams of frustration and heartbreak echoing down the quiet street. After that day, Martha stopped answering the telephone entirely. She could no longer survive the emotional whiplash of sudden hope followed by crushing devastation. By February of 1985, 4 months after the disappearance, the snow was piled high on the sidewalks of Oak Ridge, and the case was officially growing cold. The leads had dried up. The interviews were over. The FBI agents packed up their files and returned to their field offices, moving on to newer, more active cases. Only one investigator remained deeply obsessed with the timeline. His name was Detective Reynolds, a seasoned state police investigator known for his relentless attention to detail. He was a quiet, thorough man who didn't believe in bad luck. He believed in logic, and he believed that every crime had a structural flaw. He spent his days sitting in a cramped office at the local precinct, staring at the massive bulletin board covered in timelines, maps, and interview transcripts. Reynolds kept returning to the incredibly tight window of opportunity. The kidnapper had successfully snatched a child in broad daylight, in a residential neighborhood, in less than a 10-minute window, without leaving a single trace or being seen by anyone except an elderly woman with poor eyesight. It was too clean. It was too perfect. He looked at the timeline again. The bus dropped Lily off at 3:15. Sarah arrived at 3:45. The silver car was seen idling at 3:00. Reynolds frowned, tapping his pen against the desk. The silver car was waiting. It wasn't driving around looking for a target. It was parked, idling, watching the specific route. But Lily never walked that route alone. She had walked it with her older sister every single day since the school year started. If it was a crime of opportunity, a random predator driving by, they would have seen Lily walking and taken her. But a random predator wouldn't park and wait 30 minutes before the bus even arrived. Waiting implies expecting. The driver of that car expected Lily to be alone. But how could they possibly know that? The decision for Sarah to stay late wasn't made a week in advance. It wasn't a standing appointment. Reynolds pulled the transcript of Sarah's first interview. He ran his finger down the typed page until he found the section about the morning routine. Question: why didn't you meet your sister that day? Answer: I had a science project meeting. I told my mom in the kitchen before school. My partner could only meet that afternoon in the library. Reynolds paused. He picked up the phone and dialed the middle school. He asked to speak to the science teacher. After confirming the details of the project, Reynolds asked for the name of Sarah's partner, a girl named Emily Vance. Reynolds drove directly to the middle school. He sat in the principal's office and asked to speak with Emily, who was now 13. She was a quiet, nervous girl, intimidated by the detective's badge. "Emily, I want to talk about the day Lily went missing," Reynolds said softly, trying not to frighten her. "Sarah stayed after school that day to work on a science project with you in the library. She said you told her you could only meet that afternoon. Do you remember that?" Emily looked incredibly confused. She shook her head slowly. "I didn't tell her that, sir." Reynolds leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You didn't need to meet that day." "No," Emily said, her voice trembling slightly. "Our project wasn't due for another 2 weeks. I was planning on going home. But right before lunch, the main office sent a note to my classroom. It said Sarah needed to work on the project today because she was going out of town for the weekend. So I met her in the library." A cold spike of adrenaline hit Reynolds's chest. He thanked Emily, left the principal's office, and walked straight to the front desk. The school secretary, an older woman who kept meticulous records, looked up as he approached. "I need your phone logs from October 14th, Reynolds demanded, his voice tight with urgency. "Specifically the morning." The secretary pulled a thick, heavy binder from beneath the counter and flipped back through the pages to the autumn months. She ran her finger down the handwritten columns of incoming calls. "Here," she said, pointing to an entry at 9:45 a.m. "A phone call came in for Sarah Miller." "Who called?" Reynolds asked, staring at the faded blue ink. "The log says it was Sarah's mother," the secretary replied, squinting at her own handwriting. "The caller said there was a family emergency that weekend and Sarah needed to finish her science project immediately. The caller asked me to tell both Sarah and her partner, Emily, that they had to meet in the library right after school." Reynolds felt the air leave his lungs. He stared at the logbook in absolute horror. He knew for a fact that Martha Miller was working at the bank at 9:45 a.m. He had seen her time cards. He knew Martha had been fully expecting Sarah to come home at her normal time until Sarah mentioned the meeting at breakfast. Martha didn't make that call. "Did you take the message yourself?" Reynolds asked, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Did you speak to the caller?" "Yes, I did," the secretary answered, looking slightly unnerved by his intensity. "Was it a woman's voice? Did it sound like Martha Miller?" The secretary frowned, thinking back to that ordinary Tuesday morning months ago. She shook her head slowly. "No, it wasn't a woman," the secretary said quietly. "It was a man. He said he was calling on behalf of her mother. He had a very polite voice. I just assumed it was her father or an uncle helping out." Reynolds backed away from the desk, his mind racing with terrifying implications. The kidnapping of Lily Miller was not a random crime of opportunity. It was not a stranger who just happened to be driving down Elm Street. Someone had meticulously planned it. Someone knew the family's schedule. Someone knew the names of Sarah's classmates. And most horrifying of all, someone had actively manipulated the school system to trap Sarah in the library, ensuring that 7-year-old Lily would walk down that quiet street entirely alone. A predator hadn't just been waiting in a silver car. A predator had been watching them from the inside. The terrifying discovery made by Detective Reynolds changed the entire nature of the investigation. The police now knew that Lily Miller had not been taken by a random passing stranger. She had been targeted by someone who possessed intimate, specific knowledge of the Miller family's daily routine. The kidnapper knew that Sarah was the one who walked Lily home. They knew the name of Sarah's science partner. And they knew exactly how to impersonate a family member to manipulate the school secretary. Armed with this new and chilling information, the state police tore back into the investigation with renewed energy. They immediately requested a trace on the phone call that had been made to the middle school at 9:45 that morning. But this was 1984. Caller ID did not exist for the general public. Phone companies recorded long-distance charges, but local calls made from payphones or neighborhood landlines vanished into the system the second the receiver was hung up. The police hit a massive, immovable brick wall. There was simply no technological way to prove where that call originated. Desperate, investigators brought Emily Vance and her parents back into the police station. They interrogated the family for hours. Emily's father was a local accountant, a quiet man who had a rock-solid alibi at his firm, surrounded by a dozen coworkers. Emily's mother was a nurse who had been mid-shift at the county hospital. They were completely cleared. The detectives asked the parents if anyone else knew about the science project, but the family was just as confused as everyone else. The police were looking for an adult man, a seasoned predator with a silver sedan. Because of that rigid profile, they completely ignored the other person living in the Vance household. They never even considered looking at Emily's 18-year-old brother, who was quietly attending his senior year at Oak Ridge High School, just a few miles down the road. Without a name to attach to the phone call, the investigation stalled once again. The chilling reality set in. The kidnapper had successfully outsmarted the system, and slowly, agonizingly, the case went completely cold. The passage of time is a cruel and quiet thing. It doesn't stop for grief, and it doesn't wait for answers. Days bled into weeks, weeks dissolved into months, and months hardened into years. The missing person posters taped to the storefronts of Oak Ridge eventually turned yellow, curled at the edges, and blew away in the winter wind. The story of the little girl in the bright yellow raincoat faded from the front pages of the newspaper, moving to the back pages, and eventually disappearing from the news entirely. For the Miller family, the years that followed were a slow, agonizing descent into darkness. The psychological weight of the unsolved mystery slowly crushed the foundation of their home. Thomas Miller became a shadow of the gentle man he used to be. He spent his evenings sitting on the front porch, staring down the street, waiting for a little girl who was never going to walk around the corner. The stress took a heavy physical toll on his body, and in the winter of 2006, Thomas passed away from a massive heart attack. He died without ever knowing who took his youngest daughter. Martha's decline was different but equally devastating. She could not process the ambiguity of the loss. Without a funeral, without a grave to visit, Her mind simply refused to accept that Lily was gone forever. As she grew older, this denial slowly morphed into early-onset dementia. By the time the 27th anniversary of the disappearance approached, Martha's memory had severely deteriorated. She would frequently set a place for Lily at the dinner table. She would buy children's cereal at the grocery store. Eventually, it became completely unsafe for her to live alone in the large, quiet house on the cul-de-sac. And that left Sarah. In the autumn of 2011, Sarah Miller was 39 years old. Her entire life had been shaped, molded, and severely restricted by the 10 minutes she had spent in the middle school library back in 1984. The crushing guilt had never left her. It sat heavily on her chest every single day. She had never moved away from Oak Ridge. She felt anchored to the town, terrified that if she left, Lily might somehow find her way back to an empty home. Sarah had become a second-grade teacher at Oak Ridge Elementary, walking the exact same halls her little sister used to walk. She was also a mother now. She had a daughter of her own, a bright, energetic little girl named Maya, who had just turned 7 years old, the exact age Lily had been when she vanished. Because of this, Sarah was a fiercely overprotective mother. She drove Maya to school every single morning and picked her up the exact second the bell rang. She never let Maya play in the front yard alone. She never let her walk to a friend's house. The trauma of the past was tightly woven into the fabric of her present life. In late October of 2011, Sarah faced the most emotionally exhausting task of her life. She had to move her mother into a specialized care facility across town, which meant the childhood home finally had to be sold. The house on the cul-de-sac, the place where the nightmare had begun, needed to be emptied. Sarah spent a full week boxing up the rooms. Every drawer she opened, every closet she emptied was a painful trip back in time. She packed up her father's old work tools. She packed away her mother's fine china. And finally, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, she pulled down the folding wooden stairs and climbed up into the dusty, dimly lit attic. The attic smelled of old wood and dry paper. Rain drummed a steady, quiet rhythm against the roof above her head. The space was filled with cardboard boxes and old furniture draped in white sheets. Sarah spent hours sorting through old tax documents and forgotten holiday decorations. Deep in the back corner, tucked beneath a heavy winter quilt, she found a large cedar chest. It belonged to her mother. It was the place where Martha had hidden the things that were simply too painful to look at on a daily basis. Sarah wiped the dust from the lid and opened it. The hinges creaked loudly in the quiet attic. Inside, she found a collection of heartbreaking artifacts. There was the red plastic lunchbox, returned to the family by the police in 1988 when the physical evidence locker was cleared out. There was the math worksheet Sarah had been rushing to finish on the morning of October 14th. And at the very bottom of the chest, resting beneath a stack of old coloring books, was a heavy, brown manila envelope. Sarah picked it up. The paper was stiff and brittle with age. She looked at the return address stamped in the top left corner. It read, Oak Haven Portraits Fall 1984 School Pictures. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. She knew exactly what this was. Back in the 1980s, a local photography company was contracted to take the annual school portraits. They would take the photos in late September, process the film, and mail the picture packets directly to the parents' homes in late October. This envelope must have arrived in the mail just weeks after Lily disappeared. Her parents, completely shattered by grief and living in a house full of police officers, must have pulled it out of the mailbox and immediately hidden it away. They couldn't bear to look at a brand new, smiling photograph of the daughter they had just lost. The envelope was still perfectly sealed. It had been sitting in the dark for 27 years. Sarah sat down heavily on the wooden floorboards of the attic. Her hands were shaking violently. She stared at the sealed flap for a long time. She felt like she was holding a ghost. Slowly, carefully, she slid her thumb under the edge of the dried glue and tore the envelope open. She pulled out a thick stack of glossy photographs. The first sheet was the standard portrait package. There were two large 8 by 10 prints and a sheet of wallet-sized photos. Sarah stared at the image, and hot tears instantly spilled down her cheeks. It was Lily. She was wearing a red knitted sweater. Her messy brown curls were pushed back behind her ears. She was smiling her big, bright, gap-toothed smile directly at the camera, and right there, just barely visible in the V-neck of her sweater, was the tiny crescent moon birthmark. She looked so happy. She looked so safe. Sarah traced her finger over the glossy surface of the photo, letting out a quiet, broken sob. But there was something else in the envelope. In 1984, the photography studio didn't just take indoor portraits. They also sold a package called Playground Candids. The photographers would wander around the schoolyard during recess, taking natural, unposed pictures of the children playing. Hopping parents would buy the extra sheets. Sarah pulled out the second sheet of photos. It contained 4 candid shots. 3 of them were unremarkable. One was Lily sitting on the grass. Another was Lily tying her shoe. But the fourth photo made Sarah's heart completely stop beating in her chest. It was a wide shot. Lily was standing near the edge of the playground, laughing at something off camera. The focus of the camera was perfectly sharp, capturing not only Lily in the foreground but also the background behind her. Directly behind Lily was the tall chain-link fence that separated the schoolyard from the public street. Parked on the street directly behind the fence was a silver sedan. Sarah felt the air rush out of her lungs. Her eyes widened in absolute shock. She stared at the silver car, the car from the police reports. The car Mrs. Gable had seen idling near the park, the car that had swallowed her sister. It wasn't just in the neighborhood on the day of the disappearance. It had been at the school weeks earlier. But that wasn't the most terrifying part of the photograph. Leaning against the hood of the silver sedan with his arms crossed over his chest was a young man. He was looking directly through the chain-link fence. He wasn't looking at the playground in general. His head was tilted, his gaze locked intensely and specifically on Lily. Sarah scrambled backward, her back hitting the dusty wall of the attic. She couldn't breathe. She pulled her cell phone out of her pocket, her hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped it. She opened the camera app, held the phone over the old photograph, and snapped a picture. Then, she opened the image on her screen and used her fingers to zoom in as far as the digital resolution would allow. The face was slightly grainy, but it was clear enough. The young man had dark hair parted to the side. He had a strong jawline and deep-set eyes, but the most identifying feature was his clothing. He was wearing a heavy, dark wool jacket with bright white leather sleeves. It was an Oak Ridge High School letterman jacket, and stitched onto the left sleeve, clearly visible in the sunlight, was the number 84, the graduation year. He was a high school senior. Sarah's mind began to race at a terrifying speed. The pieces of a 27-year-old puzzle were suddenly violently slamming together. A high school senior, a teenager. The police had completely ignored the teenagers in the town. They had spent thousands of hours searching for a middle-aged predator. They had searched the DMV records for adults who owned silver sedans, ignoring the fact that a high school student might be driving a hand-me-down car registered in their parents' name. Sarah knew that face. It was a face from her own childhood, buried deep beneath decades of trauma, but now suddenly rushing to the surface. She dropped the phone and practically threw herself toward a stack of boxes in the corner of the attic. These were the boxes that held her own childhood things. She frantically tore open the cardboard flaps, throwing aside old notebooks and stuffed animals until she found what she was looking for. Her Oak Ridge High School yearbooks. Sarah hadn't been in high school in 1984. She was only in middle school, but her father had a habit of buying the district-wide yearbooks every year to keep a record of the town. She pulled out the thick, blue book stamped with the year 1984. She flipped past the freshman, sophomore, and junior sections. She turned to the senior portraits. She ran her finger down the alphabetical rows of smiling, youthful faces. Page after page. A B, C, Her finger traced the glossy paper until she reached the letter V. And there he was. The dark hair parted to the side, the strong jawline, the deep-set eyes. It was an exact, undeniable match to the young man leaning against the silver sedan in the playground photograph. Sarah looked down at the name printed in bold black ink beneath the picture. Mark Vance. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand to muffle the scream that tore up her throat. Mark Vance, Emily Vance's older brother. The walls of the attic felt like they were spinning. The suffocating reality of what had actually happened in 1984 finally became devastatingly clear. The kidnapper hadn't been a stranger. It had been the older brother of her own science partner. Mark Vance lived in the same house as Emily. He would have been sitting at the same kitchen table when Emily talked about her school projects. He would have known exactly who Sarah Miller was. He would have known that Sarah walked her little sister home every single day. And on the morning of October 14th, an 18-year-old boy with a polite, mature voice picked up his home telephone, called the middle school, and pretended to be an adult calling on behalf of Martha Miller. He didn't just take Lily. He engineered the entire situation to ensure she would be walking alone. He isolated his target with terrifying precision. And because he was just a local high school boy, the police never even looked in his direction. Sarah sat alone in the dim light of the attic for a long time, the yearbook resting heavily in her lap. The shock slowly began to recede, replaced by a deep, burning, blinding anger. A furious rage that had been building inside her for 27 years was suddenly given a target. Mark Vance had stolen her sister. He had destroyed her parents. He had ruined her entire life. And he had gotten away with it. She didn't call the police. Not yet. She knew how the system worked. She had watched the police fail her family for decades. A 27-year-old photograph showing a teenager leaning against a car was highly suspicious, but it was not absolute proof of a kidnapping. Mark Vance could just claim he was waiting to pick up his little sister from school. He could claim the phone call was a coincidence. If she went to the authorities now, they might open an inquiry, tip him off, and he would disappear all over again. Sarah needed to know more. She needed to know where he was. She grabbed the photograph, her phone, and the yearbook, and rushed downstairs to the living room. The house was completely silent, filled with the shadows of the late afternoon. She sat down at her laptop computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard with frantic, desperate energy. It was 2011. The world had changed. People could no longer hide as easily as they could in the 1980s. The internet held records of everything. Sarah started by searching the public property records for Oak Ridge. She found the Vance family home. The records showed that the house had been sold in December of 1985, just over a year after Lily vanished. The entire family had moved away. She opened a search engine and typed in Mark Vance. She added his approximate age, which would now be 45. She sifted through dozens of results: Mark Vances in California, Mark Vances in Texas, Mark Vances who were doctors or lawyers. None of the pictures matched. Then she narrowed the search. She typed in Mark Vance and Emily Vance together. A link appeared on the second page of the search results. It was an online obituary from 2008 for a woman named Helen Vance. The obituary listed her surviving children, her daughter, Emily Vance, residing in Chicago, and her son, Mark Vance, residing in Clear Creek, New York. Sarah's heart pounded against her ribs. Clear Creek, New York. It was a small, rural town located about 4 hours north of Oak Ridge. She immediately opened a new tab and searched for Mark Vance Clear Creek, NY. The very first result was a business website. It was a company called *Vance Landscaping and Design*. Sarah clicked on the link. The website was simple, mostly green and white text, offering lawn care and patio construction services. Her hand hovered over the computer mouse, trembling slightly as she moved the cursor to the tab at the top of the page that read, "About Us*." She clicked it. The page loaded. There in the center of the screen was a high-resolution, professional photograph. It was Mark Vance. He was 45 years old now. His dark hair was heavily streaked with gray, and there were deep lines around his eyes, but it was undeniably the same man from the high school yearbook. The same man who had leaned against the silver sedan. He was standing in front of a company truck, smiling warmly at the camera. But he wasn't alone in the photograph. Standing right beside him, with her arm wrapped casually around his waist, was a woman. Sarah read the short paragraph of text written beneath the picture. It read, Mark Vance founded Vance Landscaping in 1995. He runs the daily operations alongside his wife, Chloe, who manages the office and customer relations. Sarah's eyes slowly moved up from the text to look at the woman named Chloe. The air in the living room suddenly felt freezing cold. The silence in the house became deafening, broken only by the sound of Sarah's own rapid, shallow breathing. She leaned closer to the glowing screen, her nose almost touching the monitor. The woman in the photo appeared to be in her mid-30s. She had a thick head of messy, beautiful brown curls. She was smiling at the camera. The gap-toothed smile of her childhood was gone, likely fixed by years of braces, but the shape of her eyes, the curve of her jaw, the way her nose crinkled slightly when she smiled. It was exactly the same. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp that felt like it was going to rip her chest apart. She right-clicked on the photograph and saved it to her desktop. She opened the image file and used the magnification tool to zoom in directly on the woman's chest. The woman named Chloe was wearing a light, V-neck summer dress. And there, resting perfectly on the pale skin just below her left collarbone, clearly visible in the sharp digital image, was a small, deeply pigmented birthmark. It was shaped exactly, perfectly, like a tiny crescent moon. Sarah's chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor as she stumbled backward. The room spun wildly. The truth was so horrific, so incredibly dark, that her mind struggled to process it. Lily wasn't dead. She hadn't been murdered in the woods. Mark Vance had kidnapped a 7-year-old girl. He had taken her away, hidden her from the world, and kept her completely isolated. He had stolen her entire childhood, erased her identity, and raised her in secret. And then, when she was old enough, the monster had completely manipulated her reality and made her his wife. Lily was alive. She was living 4 hours away, and she had absolutely no idea who she really was. Sarah sat frozen in front of her computer screen for what felt like hours. The harsh, artificial light of the monitor cast long shadows across the silent living room. Her mind violently rejected what her eyes were seeing, but the terrifying evidence was right there, glaring back at her. The crescent moon birthmark, the curve of the smile, the high school yearbook photo, it all fit together with sickening, undeniable perfection. The monster hadn't just driven through their town looking for a random victim. He hadn't killed her in the woods. He had stolen her, kept her, and slowly twisted her entire reality until the little girl in the yellow raincoat was completely gone, replaced by a subservient woman named Chloe. A wave of intense physical nausea washed over Sarah. She stumbled away from the desk, rushing to the kitchen sink, gripping the cold porcelain edges as she gasped for air. The sheer psychological horror of what Mark Vance had done to her little sister was too massive to comprehend all at once. He had groomed her. He had erased her past. He had likely convinced her that her family didn't want her, or that she had no family at all. He had built an impenetrable wall of lies around her, and he had been living safely behind that wall for almost 3 decades. When the initial shock finally began to recede, it was instantly replaced by a cold, sharp, and highly focused rage. Sarah's hand stopped shaking. A fierce, protective maternal instinct took over completely. She could not just call the police. The Oak Ridge Police Department had failed her family spectacularly 27 years ago. They had missed the high school connection. They had missed the silver sedan at the playground. If she handed them this information now, they would open an investigation. They would make phone calls. They would alert the local authorities in New York. The bureaucracy would be slow and loud. And Mark Vance would hear them coming. A man capable of orchestrating such a flawless, long-term abduction was not a fool. He was calculated, patient, and deeply controlling. If he saw a single police cruiser pull up to his landscaping business, if he got even the slightest hint that his decades-old secret was unraveling, he would panic. He would grab Lily, force her into a car, and they would disappear again. Or worse. If Mark realized he was going to lose his prize and spend the rest of his life in federal prison, there was no telling what kind of violence he might inflict. Sarah knew that a police raid could quickly turn into a hostage situation. Lily didn't know she was a victim. She believed Mark was her husband. She would be terrified. She would likely defend him. Sarah couldn't risk a violent confrontation that might end with her sister getting hurt or killed. She had to do this herself. She had to be the one to break the illusion. She needed to look her sister in the eye and show her the undeniable truth before Mark even realized what was happening. The next morning, Sarah moved with quiet, methodical precision. She called the principal of the elementary school and requested a week of emergency family leave, citing her mother's declining health. It wasn't entirely a lie, but it was the cover she needed. She packed a small suitcase. She drove her daughter, Maya, to her best friend's house across town, explaining that she had to handle some difficult legal issues regarding her father's estate. Before she left Oak Ridge, Sarah made one final stop. She drove to her mother's empty house. She went straight to the dusty attic and opened the cedar chest. She took the heavy Oakhaven Portraits envelope, and then she reached in and carefully picked up the red plastic lunchbox. She wiped the decades of dust from the bright red surface, folded the small handle down, and placed it on the passenger seat of her car. It was the anchor. It was the only physical object that still connected Lily to the day she was taken. The drive to Clear Creek, New York, took 4 hours, but to Sarah, it felt like a lifetime. The highway stretched endlessly forward, cutting through dense, gray forests and rolling hills. The sky was heavily overcast, a thick blanket of gray clouds that mirrored the exact weather of that terrible Tuesday in 1984. The further north she drove, the more isolated the landscape became. Towns grew smaller and further apart. The busy highways narrowed into 2-lane county roads, surrounded by thick pine trees and heavy brush. It was the perfect place to hide someone. Clear Creek was a tiny, rural community. It had a single main street with a gas station, a small grocery store, a hardware supply shop, and a post office. The residential houses were spread far apart, separated by acres of dense woods and long, gravel driveways. Privacy wasn't just respected here, it was geographically enforced. Sarah found Vance Landscaping and Design on the outskirts of town. It was situated on a large, sprawling plot of land at the end of a dead-end road. There was a modest, 2-story house painted a dull gray, set far back from the street. Attached to the property was a massive corrugated steel garage where the landscaping equipment was stored. 3 heavy-duty pickup trucks bearing the company logo were parked in the wide gravel driveway. Sarah did not pull in. She drove past the property slowly, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She drove a 1/4 of a mile down the road, pulled her car onto a narrow dirt shoulder completely hidden by a thick line of spruce trees, and turned off the engine. From this vantage point, looking through the trees, she had a clear view of the front of the house and the main driveway. She settled into the cold car and began the agonizing process of waiting. For the first 3 hours there was no movement. The house remained perfectly still. Sarah sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel, drinking cold coffee from a thermos, and watching the property with intense, unwavering focus. Just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy steel door of the garage rolled open with a loud metallic rattle that echoed across the quiet road. A man walked out. Sarah instinctively ducked down lower in her seat, even though she was much too far away to be seen. She picked up a pair of small binoculars she had brought from her father's old hunting gear and pressed them to her eyes. The lenses magnified the scene, bringing the man sharply into focus. It was Mark Vance. The high school senior was completely gone, replaced by a thick, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s. He was wearing heavy work boots, faded jeans, and a thick flannel shirt. He moved with a heavy, authoritative swagger. He barked orders at two younger men who walked out of the garage behind him, carrying shovels and bags of fertilizer to the back of the pickup trucks. Sarah watched him, feeling a physical wave of revulsion wash over her. This was the man who had stalked her little sister. This was the man who had made that polite phone call. He looked so devastatingly normal. He looked like an ordinary, hard-working business owner. There was absolutely nothing about him that broadcast the horrific monster he truly was. And then the front door of the house opened. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She gripped the binoculars so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. A woman stepped out onto the front porch. She was holding a stack of clipboards and a set of keys. She walked down the wooden steps and approached Mark in the driveway. Through the binoculars, Sarah finally saw her sister in real life. The digital photograph on the computer screen had not prepared her for the visceral shock of seeing her move and breathe. It was Lily. Her face was older, framed by the familiar thick brown curls, but the delicate features were the exact same. She looked incredibly much like their mother, Martha, when Martha had been in her 30s. Sarah pressed her hand against her mouth to keep from sobbing out loud. She wanted to throw open the car door. She wanted to sprint down the road, tackle Mark to the gravel, and hold her sister tightly. But she forced herself to stay perfectly still. She had to observe. She needed to understand the dynamic of their relationship before she made her move. Through the magnified lenses, Sarah watched them interact. It was deeply disturbing. There was no warmth. There was no casual affection. Lily handed the clipboards to Mark, her posture slightly stooped, her eyes focused on the ground. Mark didn't smile at her. He snatched the clipboards from her hands, flipped through the papers aggressively, and pointed his finger toward the house, giving her a sharp command. Lily nodded quickly, stepping back away from him. Before she turned to walk away, Mark reached out and grabbed her by the back of the neck. It wasn't a loving gesture. It was a heavy, possessive grip. His thick fingers squeezed the back of her neck tightly, giving her a small, physical shake. Lily didn't flinch. She just stood perfectly still until he let her go. Then she quickly turned and hurried back inside the house, closing the door softly behind her. Sarah lowered the binoculars, tears of fury blurring her vision. The psychological control was absolute. Mark didn't treat her like a partner. He treated her like property. He had molded her into a submissive, fearful companion. For the next 2 days, Sarah lived in her car and a cheap motel 3 towns over. She meticulously tracked their routine. Mark and his landscaping crew left the property every morning around 7:30, heading out to various job sites around the county. They usually didn't return until late in the afternoon. Lily never left the property. She didn't have her own car. There was no personal vehicle parked near the house, only the heavy commercial trucks. Once Mark left, Lily spent her days entirely isolated. Sarah watched her come out to the mailbox at the end of the driveway. She watched her sweep the front porch. She watched her sit on a wooden bench in the yard, staring blankly at the dense wall of trees. Lily was a ghost, trapped on a remote piece of land, entirely dependent on the man who had stolen her. Sarah realized she needed more context before the confrontation. She drove into the center of Clear Creek and visited the small town hall. The clerk's office was quiet and mostly empty. Sarah, pretending to be a background investigator for an insurance company, requested public records for Mark and Chloe Vance. The elderly woman behind the counter was helpful but slow. She pulled a few files from the metal cabinets in the back room. Sarah flipped through the documents with trembling hands. She found their marriage certificate. It was dated May of 1996. The math hit Sarah like a punch to the stomach. 1996. Lily would have been 19 years old. Mark would have been 30. He had kept her hidden for 12 years, waiting until she was legally an adult before filing the paperwork to permanently bind her to him. But it was the background information on Chloe that revealed the true depth of Mark's deception. On the marriage certificate, Chloe's maiden name was listed as Adams. Her place of birth was listed as an obscure, unincorporated township in a neighboring state. There was no social security number listed, only a note indicating a delayed filing. "Excuse me," Sarah said to the clerk, trying to keep her voice steady. "Do you have any school records for Chloe Vance or Chloe Adams? Did she attend the local high school here?" The clerk shook her head slowly. "No, dear. I remember when Mark brought her to town. It was the early 90s. He said she was a runaway he had taken in, said she had a rough life and no family. He homeschooled her himself. They've always kept entirely to themselves. Quiet folks." The sickness in Sarah's stomach twisted tighter. A runaway. He had convinced the town she was a troubled teenager he was saving. And because Clear Creek was a place that minded its own business, no one ever asked any difficult questions. No one ever looked closely at the terrified girl with the brown curls. He had successfully rewritten her entire existence. Sarah left the town hall and sat in her car in the parking lot. The picture was complete. She knew exactly how he had done it. She knew exactly what Lily's life had been for the last 27 years. The investigation was over. It was time for the final discovery. It was Thursday morning. The sky over Clear Creek was dark and heavy, threatening rain. Sarah parked her car in her usual hidden spot down the road from the Vance property. At exactly 7:30, the garage door opened. The heavy diesel engines of the landscaping trucks roared to life. Sarah watched through the binoculars as Mark climbed into the lead truck. The two younger crew members climbed into the second truck. The tires crunched loudly against the gravel as the heavy vehicles pulled out of the driveway, turned onto the main road, and drove away, heading in the opposite direction. The property fell completely silent. The gray house stood alone against the backdrop of the dark woods. Mark was gone. He wouldn't be back for hours. Lily was completely alone inside. This was the moment, the window of opportunity she had been waiting for. Sarah reached into the passenger seat and picked up the red plastic lunchbox. She unlatched the small metal clasp and opened the lid. Inside, she had carefully placed the stack of glossy school photographs from 1984, the Oakhaven Portraits envelope, and the heavy blue Oak Ridge High School yearbook. She closed the lid and locked it tight. She opened her car door and stepped out into the cold morning air. Her legs felt heavy, like she was walking through wet sand. Every step she took away from her car and toward the property carried the weight of 27 years of grief, guilt, and agonizing silence. She walked down the narrow shoulder of the road until she reached the entrance of the Vance driveway. The gravel crunched loudly beneath her shoes. She didn't try to hide anymore. She walked straight up the center of the driveway, her eyes locked firmly on the front door of the gray house. The wind picked up, rustling the branches of the tall pine trees that surrounded the yard. The house looked dark and uninviting. The blinds on the front windows were tightly drawn. Sarah reached the bottom of the wooden porch steps. Her heart was beating so fiercely she could feel the pulse pounding in her throat. She gripped the handle of the red lunchbox so tightly her fingers ached. She slowly walked up the steps. 1, 2, 3. She stood on the porch. She was inches away from the heavy wooden door. Behind this door was the little sister she had failed to protect. Behind this door was a woman who didn't know her own name. Behind this door was the terrifying collision of a horrific past and a fragile, deeply manipulated present. Sarah raised her right hand. She curled her fingers into a fist. She held her hand suspended in the air, hovering just an inch away from the solid wood of the door. The truth was finally here. The longest nightmare of her life was about to violently end. She took one last, deep breath, bracing herself for the psychological explosion that was about to occur. Sarah brought her trembling knuckles forward and knocked heavily on the thick wood. The sound echoed loudly on the quiet porch, sharp and demanding. She stepped back, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. She gripped the handle of the red plastic lunchbox with both hands, holding it securely against her stomach like a shield. The wind blew through the tall pine trees, making a low, rushing sound. For a long moment there was no answer. Sarah thought about knocking again, wondering if Lily was hiding, or if she had been strictly forbidden from answering the door while Mark was away. But then she heard the heavy sliding sound of a deadbolt turning, followed by the click of a second lock. The door slowly opened, just a few inches. A face appeared in the narrow gap. It was Lily. Up close, the resemblance to their mother was absolutely breathtaking. She had the same soft brown eyes, the same curve of her cheekbones, and the same thick, messy brown curls that framed her face. But her expression was incredibly guarded. There was a deep, underlying fear in her eyes, a kind of nervous exhaustion that comes from living a life of constant, quiet submission. She looked at Sarah with total confusion. "Can I help you?" Lily asked. Her voice was soft, slightly raspy, and completely unrecognizable from the bright, loud 7-year-old Sarah remembered. Sarah felt a massive lump form in her throat. She tried to speak, but the words caught. She was looking at the ghost that had haunted her entire life, suddenly breathing and speaking right in front of her. "We don't buy anything," Lily added quickly, her eyes darting nervously past Sarah, scanning the empty driveway to make sure no one else was there. "My husband isn't home. You should go." Lily started to close the door. "Wait," Sarah gasped, pushing her open hand against the flat wood of the door to stop it from shutting. "Please wait. I'm not selling anything. I'm not a stranger." Lily paused, but she kept the door mostly closed, keeping her body hidden. "I don't know you. You need to leave before my husband gets back." Sarah took a deep, shaky breath. She looked directly into her sister's frightened brown eyes. "My name is Sarah Miller. I came from Oakhaven. I came from Oak Ridge, Pennsylvania." The names clearly meant nothing to the woman standing in the doorway. She just stared at Sarah, completely blank. The brainwashing had been total. Mark had successfully erased every single geographical memory she possessed. "I don't know where that is," Lily whispered. "Please let go of the door." Sarah realized that words were not going to break through the 27-year-old wall of lies. Mark had spent decades telling her she was a runaway named Chloe Adams. He had built a fortress of deception around her mind. Sarah needed to bypass the logic and strike directly at the buried primal memories. Sarah slowly lowered her hand from the door. With trembling fingers, she lifted the red plastic lunchbox up so that it was perfectly centered in the narrow gap, right in Lily's line of sight. "You don't remember Oak Ridge," Sarah said, her voice shaking with raw emotion. "But do you remember this?" Lily looked down at the object. At first, her expression was just confused. But as her eyes focused on the bright red plastic, the folded white handle, and the small metal clasp, a profound and terrifying physical change washed over her body. Her eyes widened drastically. The color instantly drained from her face, leaving her pale as a ghost. Her breathing completely stopped. She stared at the lunchbox as if it were a bomb about to explode. Her hands, which had been resting on the edge of the door, began to shake violently. Deep, buried trauma was violently fighting its way to the surface. It was a memory locked away in a dark room of her mind, suddenly kicking the door open. She didn't have the context for the memory, but her body remembered the feeling. She remembered holding it. She remembered the color. "Where?" Lily stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Where did you get that?" "You left it on a stone wall," Sarah said softly, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and running down her cheeks. "On the corner of Elm Street and Maple Drive. You put it down right before he took you." Lily let go of the door entirely. She stumbled backward into the dark entryway of the house, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Sarah pushed the door wide open and stepped inside. The house was spotless, sterile, and entirely devoid of personality. There were no family pictures on the walls. There were no decorative pillows. It felt exactly like what it was, a prison cell disguised as a home. Lily backed away until her shoulders hit the wall of the hallway. She looked completely terrified, panting heavily. "Who are you?" she cried out. "Why do you have that? What are you talking about?" "You are not Chloe Adams," Sarah said, walking slowly toward her, holding the lunchbox out like an offering. "Your name is Lily. Your name is Lily Miller, and I am your older sister." "No," Lily shouted, squeezing her eyes shut and shaking her head frantically. "No, you're lying. I don't have a sister. I don't have a family. Mark found me. He saved me." The denial was desperate and panicked. It was the only defense mechanism she had left. If she accepted what Sarah was saying, her entire world, everything she had believed for 27 years, would instantly collapse into absolute horror. Sarah didn't argue. She set the red lunchbox down on a small wooden table in the hallway. She unlatched the metal clasp and flipped the lid open. She reached inside and pulled out the thick Oakhaven Portraits envelope. "Look at me," Sarah pleaded, her voice breaking. "Please, Lily, just look." Lily opened her eyes, tears streaming down her own face. She watched as Sarah pulled the large 8x10 portrait from the envelope and held it up. It was the picture of the 7-year-old girl in the red knitted sweater. The little girl with the messy brown curls and the bright gap-toothed smile. Lily stared at the photograph. Her breathing slowed down into short, shallow gasps. She slowly raised a trembling hand and touched her own face, tracing the curve of her jaw, the shape of her nose. She was looking at a ghost of herself. She was looking at a past she had been told never existed. "Look right here," Sarah whispered, pointing to the bottom edge of the V-neck sweater in the photograph. "You have a birthmark, shaped like a tiny crescent moon, just below your left collarbone." Lily let out a sharp, devastated sob. Her hand dropped from her face and went straight to her collarbone, pressing against the fabric of her shirt, directly over the hidden mark. She knew the mark was there. Mark had always told her it was just a random blemish. "Our mother used to call it your star mark," Sarah said gently. "She kissed it every single night before you went asleep." The wall of lies began to crack. The foundation of her false identity was crumbling rapidly under the sheer weight of the physical evidence. Lily slid slowly down the hallway wall until she was sitting on the hardwood floor, pulling her knees to her chest, rocking back and forth. "I was supposed to walk you home that day," Sarah said, dropping to her knees right in front of her sister. "I stayed late at school for a project. You got off the bus alone, and he was waiting for you. I have spent 27 years believing it was my fault. I thought you were dead, Lily. We all did." "Mark said I was a runaway," Lily sobbed, hiding her face in her hands. "He said I was lost in the city. He said he brought me here to protect me. He said no one wanted me." The cruelty of the lie made Sarah's blood boil. She reached into the lunchbox and pulled out the second sheet of photos, the playground candids. Then, she pulled out the heavy blue 1984 Oak Ridge High School yearbook. "He didn't find you in the city, Lily," Sarah said, her voice hardening with quiet, focused anger. "He stole you from our neighborhood. He planned it." Sarah placed the playground photograph on the floor, right in front of Lily's shoes. She pointed to the silver car parked behind the chain-link fence, and she pointed to the young man leaning against the hood, watching the 7-year-old girl play. Lily lifted her head, her tear-filled eyes focused on the photograph. She recognized the young man instantly. Even 27 years younger, the face of the man who controlled her life was unmistakable. It was Mark. "He was stalking you," Sarah explained, opening the yearbook and turning to the senior portraits. She placed the book next to the photograph, showing Mark Vance's name printed in black ink. "He was a senior at the local high school. He used a fake phone call to trap me at the school so you would have to walk home alone. He parked his car down the street and he took you." Lily stared at the evidence, The photograph, the yearbook, the lunchbox. The truth was absolute, undeniable, and utterly horrifying. The man she lived with. The man she slept next to. The man who dictated what she wore, what she ate, and when she could speak, was not her savior. He was the monster who had ripped her away from her mother, her father, and her sister. He had stolen her entire life, erased her childhood, and imprisoned her in a lie. The psychological dam finally broke completely. Lily let out a scream. It wasn't just a cry of sadness. It was a visceral, agonizing scream of pure, unadulterated grief and horror. It was the sound of a human soul breaking in half. She threw her hands over her ears, curling into a tight ball on the floor, screaming as decades of suppressed trauma, manipulation, and stolen time crashed down on her all at once. Sarah threw her arms around her sister. She pulled Lily tightly against her chest, holding her as she thrashed and sobbed. Sarah was crying just as hard, burying her face in Lily's messy brown curls. They sat on the floor of the sterile hallway for a long time, two sisters violently reunited in the wreckage of a stolen life. When the initial, violent wave of shock finally began to subside, leaving Lily exhausted and trembling, Sarah gently pulled back. She grabbed Lily by the shoulders, forcing her to look up. "We have to go," Sarah said, her voice firm and urgent. "We have to leave right now. He could come back for lunch. If he finds me here, he will never let you leave." Lily looked around the empty house with wide, terrified eyes. The house no longer looked like a home. It looked like a cage she had just woken up inside. She nodded quickly, wiping the tears from her face with the back of her trembling hands. "I don't have anything to pack," Lily whispered. "He buys everything, nothing is mine." "You don't need anything from this place," Sarah said fiercely. "Everything you need is in my car." Sarah quickly gathered the yearbook, the photographs, and the lunchbox. She grabbed Lily by the hand, pulling her up from the floor. They walked out of the front door, leaving it wide open behind them. They didn't lock it. They didn't look back. They ran down the gravel driveway together, their footsteps echoing loudly in the cold morning air. When they reached Sarah's car hidden behind the trees, Sarah opened the passenger door and helped Lily inside. She ran around to the driver's side, started the engine, and slammed her foot on the gas pedal. The car threw dirt and gravel into the air as it sped away from the property, leaving the dark, isolated nightmare behind forever. Sarah did not drive to the local Clear Creek Town Hall. She knew that Mark had lived in that small town for decades. He might have friends in the local police force. He might have connections. She was not going to take any chances. Instead, Sarah drove entirely out of the county. She drove for an hour and a half at high speed, her eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror, until they reached a large, sprawling city that housed the regional headquarters for the state police. They walked into the brightly lit lobby of the massive police precinct. Lily was shaking uncontrollably, clinging tightly to Sarah's arm, terrified of the loud noises and the uniformed officers walking past. Sarah marched directly up to the front desk and demanded to speak to the highest-ranking detective available. When the desk sergeant saw the frantic, desperate look in Sarah's eyes and the red plastic lunchbox clutched in her hands, he quickly made a phone call. 10 minutes later, Sarah and Lily were sitting in a quiet, secure interview room. A senior investigator named Captain Miller, a man in his late 50s with a stern but empathetic face, walked into the room. Sarah didn't wait for him to ask questions. She opened the lunchbox and spread the evidence entirely across the metal table. She laid out the Oak Haven portrait, the playground candid, the 1984 Oak Ridge High School yearbook, and the public property records she had printed from the internet. Then she looked Captain Miller dead in the eye. In October of 1984, a 7-year-old girl named Lily Miller was abducted from Oak Ridge, Pennsylvania, Sarah said, her voice steady and powerful. The police searched for a middle-aged man in a silver sedan. They missed the teenager who went to the local high school. He took her. He moved across state lines. He changed her name to Chloe Adams, and he kept her prisoner for 27 years. Sarah reached over and gently took Lily's trembling hand. "This is Lily Miller," Sarah said, "and the man who took her is named Mark Vance. He is currently running a landscaping business in Clear Creek, New York." Captain Miller stared at the table in absolute silence. He looked at the old photograph. He looked at the yearbook. And then he looked directly at Lily's face. He didn't need a DNA test right that second to know he was looking at the truth. The physical resemblance to the missing child, combined with the terrifying timeline Sarah had just laid out, was overwhelming. The reaction of the state police was instantaneous and massive. The quiet, bureaucratic pace of a cold case completely vanished. This was an active, ongoing hostage situation and a federal kidnapping crime. Within an hour, the state police contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They coordinated a joint task force. They secured a federal arrest warrant for Mark Vance. Because of the extreme length of the abduction and the unknown psychological state of the kidnapper, they did not send a standard patrol car. They mobilized a heavily armed tactical team. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Mark Vance was standing in the dirt driveway of a wealthy client's property, yelling at his crew to load the heavy bags of mulch faster. He felt entirely secure in his life. He had spent decades believing he was untouchable. He believed he had committed the perfect crime. He didn't even hear the vehicles approaching until they had already blocked the driveway. 3 unmarked black SUVs and 2 state police cruisers suddenly swarmed the property, their sirens blaring and tires tearing up the grass. Before Mark could even drop his clipboard, heavily armed federal agents were out of the vehicles, weapons drawn, shouting commands that echoed like thunder across the quiet neighborhood. "Mark Vance, get on the ground, do it now." Mark froze. The absolute shock on his face was profound. The arrogant, commanding facade he wore every day instantly shattered. He looked at the police cars and then he looked toward the road as if expecting to see Lily standing there. He didn't run. There was nowhere to run. The decades of lies had finally caught up to him. He slowly lowered himself to his knees in the dirt, raising his hands in the air. Federal agents swarmed him, pushing his face roughly into the gravel, pulling his arms violently behind his back, and snapping heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. "Mark Vance, you are under arrest for the 1984 kidnapping of Lily Miller," an agent read loudly. Mark closed his eyes, his face pressed into the dirt. The monster of Oak Ridge had finally been caught. He would never see Lily again. He would spend the rest of his natural life in a maximum security federal prison, stripped of the control he so desperately craved. While the raid was happening, Lily remained safe in the police headquarters. The state police arranged for a victim's advocate and a trauma psychologist to sit with her. They took her fingerprints, which they later matched perfectly to a small set of prints lifted from one of her childhood toys kept in police evidence. The scientific confirmation was just a formality. The nightmare was officially over. The aftermath of the discovery was a long, incredibly painful and beautiful process. It was not a magical, instant recovery. Lily could not simply erase 27 years of psychological trauma and instantly become the little girl she used to be. She had to learn how to exist in a world she had been completely hidden from. Sarah brought Lily back to Oak Ridge. She didn't take her to the old house on the cul-de-sac. That house had already been sold, and it held too many dark memories of the day she was taken. Instead, Sarah brought Lily to her own home. The first time Lily met Maya, Sarah's 7-year-old daughter, was a moment that broke everyone's heart. Maya came running out of the house, a bright burst of energy with messy brown curls, looking exactly like the little girl in the Oakhaven portrait. Lily fell to her knees in the grass, weeping uncontrollably as she hugged her niece, feeling the echoes of her own stolen childhood wrapping their arms around her. Sarah became Lily's anchor. They spent hours sitting in the living room, looking through old photo albums. Sarah told Lily about their father, Thomas. She told her how much he had loved her, how he had searched the woods for weeks, and how he had died still waiting for her to come home. It was agonizing for Lily to grieve a father she had been forced to forget, but the grief was also a powerful form of healing. It meant she was finally real again. But the most emotional moment came 3 weeks after the rescue. Sarah drove Lily to the specialized care facility on the other side of town to see their mother, Martha. Martha's dementia was severe. She spent most of her days sitting in a comfortable chair by the window of her room, staring out at the gardens, lost in the confusing fog of her own fatting mind. Sarah walked into the room first, holding Lily's hand tightly. Lily was terrified. She felt immense guilt, entirely misplaced for being gone so long. "Mom," Sarah said softly, kneeling beside the chair. "Mom, I brought someone to see you." Martha slowly turned her head. Her eyes were clouded and her expression was vacant. She looked at Sarah, offering a faint, polite smile that showed she recognized a friendly face, but not necessarily her daughter's name. Then Martha's eyes moved past Sarah. She looked at the woman standing nervously near the doorway. She looked at the messy brown curls. She looked at the soft brown eyes. She looked at the face that mirrored her own past so perfectly. For a long, tense moment, the room was completely silent. The fog in Martha's eyes seemed to suddenly part, pushed away by a force stronger than the disease destroying her brain. A deep, maternal instinct, buried beneath decades of grief and illness, violently flared to life. Martha raised her shaking, fragile hand and pointed a single, crooked finger toward Lily. "You wore your yellow raincoat," Martha whispered, her voice cracking with a sudden, astonishing clarity. "I told you to come straight home." Lily let out a broken sob and rushed across the room. She fell to her knees beside the chair, burying her face in her mother's lap. Martha didn't ask where she had been. She didn't ask why she was a grown woman now. She simply placed her frail hands on Lily's head, stroking her messy brown curls exactly the way she had done at the breakfast table 27 years earlier. "You're home now, sweetie," Martha murmured softly, staring out the window with tears forming in her clouded eyes. "My little star mark is finally home." Sarah stood in the corner of the room, crying silently, watching her family finally, impossibly, become whole again. The story of Lily Miller is a terrifying reminder of how easily evil can hide in plain sight. It proves that the most dangerous monsters do not always lurk in the dark woods. Sometimes, they are the quiet teenagers walking the halls of the local high school. Sometimes, they are the polite voices on the other end of the telephone. They hide their darkness behind a facade of normalcy, manipulating trust, and exploiting the innocence of a quiet community. But the story also serves as a profound testament to the unbreakable power of truth and the enduring strength of family. A secret, no matter how perfectly guarded, no matter how many years it is buried beneath lies and manipulation, can never truly be erased. It only takes one small mistake, one forgotten envelope hidden in an attic, one tiny crescent moon birthmark captured in a photograph. Mark Vance spent 27 years believing he had successfully destroyed a life and rewritten history, but he underestimated the quiet, patient persistence of the truth. He underestimated the fierce, unwavering love of an older sister who refused to let the past remain completely buried. Lily Miller lost 27 years of her life. She lost her childhood, her father, and her identity. But in the end, she survived. She reclaimed her real name. She reclaimed her family. And as she sat in the garden with her older sister and her young niece, watching the sun set over the quiet town, she finally knew exactly who she was, and she knew she would never, ever be lost again.